Welcome to the 6th episode of Jillian's Clinical Corner. Today we are talking about verbal prompts. So first, I actually want to start with the warnings of using verbal prompts. What are the biggest warnings that you've heard? Most likely, verbal prompts are hardest to fade, right? Everybody always hears that verbal prompts are hardest to fade. Also, verbal prompts can become embedded in skills. Kind of goes with the first one, that they're hard to fade because they become embedded. We should never use verbal prompts for self-help skills or activities of daily living. Never use a verbal prompt for something that doesn't have a verbal response or something they should be doing without someone needing to tell them to do it. So there's a lot of warnings related to verbal prompts, kind of causing everyone to kind of shy away from them and not use them so much. But let's discuss how we are currently using verbal prompts. So for tasks that have a verbal response, typically we're using a verbal prompt, sometimes, as part of the prompt hierarchy. So here is where it falls in the most to least. So most intrusive prompt down to the least intrusive prompt. And I've seen this just in my experience, in my research, in my schooling. I've seen this kind of as the basic prompt hierarchy. It could definitely be customized to a specific learner, and there are other prompts that exist that don't fall within this basic prompt hierarchy. But here is the basic one that I've learned and read through research. Full physical prompt as the most intrusive, partial physical, model, gesture, verbal prompt, then independence. Now, I know, like I said, there are other types of prompts, such as picture or visual prompts, but in my experience, that right there is the basic prompt hierarchy. So does the verbal prompt really fit there with all those warnings attached to it? Should a verbal prompt be included in the prompt hierarchy like that at all? And not only is it included, it's really included and marked as the least intrusive prompt in that situation. Are these really the only times we're also using verbal prompts? So I listed some times that we're typically using verbal prompts. I think sometimes we're using them a lot more than we have programmed for. We're giving a little yes or no to indicate a correct or incorrect response. Just giving a little additional verbal prompt without us even realizing it. So this brings us back around to our warnings from the beginning. If verbal prompts are included in the prompt hierarchy as one of the least intrusive prompts, should we really stay away from them? What does the research say about prompt hierarchies and the use of verbal prompts? Is there any research on that specifically? What I looked for to determine more about this was prompt fading strategies. A great resource here is McDuff, Krantz, and McClanahan's chapter in the book Behavioral Intervention for Autism from 2011 about prompts and prompt fading strategies. Now, the reason I looked at prompt fading strategies is that a lot of the warnings about verbal prompts relates to them being difficult to fade and difficult, typically becoming embedded in the task, therefore, of course, making them difficult to fade. So verbal prompting is cited as a least intrusive prompt in the research. For example, in that book chapter, McDuff, Krantz, and McClanahan stated, quote, most to least prompt system often include complete physical guidance, partial physical guidance, modeling, gesture prompts, and verbal instructions, end quote. So there is confirmation and a reference. There are many others, but there's a reference from a reputable chapter that I myself read throughout my schooling. Why would this prompt be thought of as a less intrusive prompt if it's also the most difficult to fade? So continue on. So one important topic covered in this chapter and in much research is prompt fading. So not necessarily that verbal prompts themselves are difficult to fade, but that prompts in general need to have a plan for fading lest they become embedded in the teaching process permanently. So basically what this chapter says that's important is that every prompt needs to have a fading plan. So maybe you shy away from a verbal prompt, but even if you're using a physical prompt, that can easily become embedded in the task, in the teaching process, if you don't have a plan for fading away that prompt. So why might verbal prompts be thought of as more difficult to fade? What would the possible steps be for fading your verbal prompt? For fading a physical prompt, you can do a full physical, you could do a partial physical, you can move that to shadowing. But a verbal prompt, what would be the fading procedure? Whispering, saying less words in the sentence, moving to a less intrusive textual prompt, and then fading the text. Maybe it would make sense to skip the verbal prompt in that situation and start with the textual prompt first then. I've seen people use kind of those little voice recorders or mini-me's in place of the verbal prompt from another person. That's fine. You still most likely will have to find a way to fade that out and either fade it by fading the volume or less words or removing the cue of the mini-me. Something else important that this chapter covers is practical advice on how to select a prompt. And I think that this is really important when choosing should you select a verbal prompt or a different type. Of course, you're going to select based on your learner, but it's important to ensure that your client is attending to the prompt, not a different environmental factor such as a head nod or those other kind of embedded verbal prompts that we might not realize. You want to make sure that the prompt you select or focus to fading on is more closely related to the natural environment. So whatever prompt you're fading it down to, you want to get closer and closer to the natural environment and the prompts that occur just in the natural environment. This is often why verbal prompts may be shied away from. How often would someone count to 5 while you wash your hands to indicate the length of time that you should wash your hands for? Other pieces of advice that pertain here include shifting reinforcement from prompting to unprompted responses. That's just good procedure when fading from prompted to unprompted responses, regardless of what type of prompt is used, and to begin fading your prompts as quickly as possible, but not so quickly that your client makes frequent errors. So these are just good strategies, whether you use a verbal prompt or not. Whatever type of prompt you're using, you want to focus on the fading, but quickly, but not so quickly that errors are coming up again. If this occurs, errors, go back to the previous prompt level or the highest prompt level needed to get a correct response. So I think clinically speaking, the takeaway from this should be to think about all prompts, not just verbal prompts, before you embed them into a teaching task. Think about how and when you're going to fade those prompts, but also consider prompts that we have embedded in our everyday lives to help us function. I wake up every day with an alarm clock. Otherwise, I'd oversleep. I have a checklist full of reminders for things to accomplish that day, and to be honest, I am largely prompt dependent on this. My motto is, if it's not written down, it's forgotten. I have a calendar with appointments. Prompts to remember to do things are really quite common in the general population. So while we should be teaching our learners with the goal of independence, remember that embedded prompts that still allow them to reach independence may be very typical, even if it's something you wouldn't typically need a prompt for, such as using the soap, checking for a tag on a shirt so you put it on correctly, or other self-help tasks. Keep in mind also that you want these prompts to be things that the learner can access themselves, which is why verbal prompts might not be the best to embed throughout our practice. They depend on another person to provide them, and therefore do not achieve true independence for our learners. I wanted to end our clinical corner this week by reminding everybody that you can access the Google Hangouts and chat.google.com. And this thread right here will be used to discuss verbal prompts. I will add the video recording of this clinical corner. You can also, don't forget, use the Google Hangouts chat to communicate with everybody across Graham Behavior Services. This is a HIPAA compliant way, as opposed to text messaging, to communicate with each other in an in-the-moment, immediate kind of way. Okay, any questions about that, you guys can send me an email.